The wind rattled the barn doors with enough force to wake Callum Drake from a sleep that had never been deep to begin with, and he pulled on his boots in the darkness, knowing that his mare got skittish in storms and would need calming before she kicked her stall apart. He grabbed the lantern from beside his bed and lit it with practiced efficiency, shouldering into his worn coat as he crossed from the small farmhouse to the barn through rain that fell in sheets, turning the path to mud beneath his feet. The barn was warm compared to the night air, smelling of hay and horse and leather, and he lifted the lantern high as he stepped inside, calling out softly to his mare to let her know he was coming. But the sound that greeted him was not the nervous whinny he expected. It was a whimper, low and pained, coming from somewhere near the back of the barn. Callum froze, his hand instinctively moving to the knife at his belt, his eyes scanning the shadows beyond the lantern's reach. Bandits sometimes used storms as cover, and he had fought off more than one desperate thief in the 3 years since he had come to this lonely stretch of farmland on the kingdom's western frontier. He moved slowly, keeping his steps quiet despite the storm's noise, and as he rounded the empty stall where he kept his plow tools, he saw her. She was curled on the barn floor, her body pressed against the wall as though trying to make herself as small as possible, and even in the dim light he could see the green of her skin, the sharp points of her ears, the small tusks that jutted from her lower jaw. An orc. A girl, barely more than 18 if he had to guess, her clothes torn and muddy, her arms wrapped around herself as she shivered violently. Blood matted her dark hair on one side, and her breathing came in shallow gasps that misted in the cold air. Callum's first instinct was to back away, to get his crossbow and drive her off his property before she could attack him or steal from him or call down her clan on his head. Orcs were dangerous. Everyone knew that. They raided the border villages, burned crops, killed livestock and people both. The war had ended 5 years ago, but the hatred had not, and there were still skirmishes in the hills, still blood spilled on both sides. He had been a soldier once, had fought orcs in battle, had seen good men die with orcish arrows in their chests, but this girl was not raiding anything. She was dying. He could see it in the way her body shook, in the glassy look of her eyes when she finally noticed him and tried to push herself upright, only to collapse back against the wall with a cry of pain. She said something in the orcish tongue, harsh and guttural, and he did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. She was telling him to stay back, or maybe begging him not to hurt her. Her hand moved to her side, and he saw the dark stain spreading across her shirt, the way she pressed her palm against the wound as though she could hold her life inside her body through will alone. Callum stood there for a long moment, the lantern trembling in his hand, torn between every instinct that told him to protect himself and the memory of his mother's voice telling him that mercy was not weakness. He thought of the stories the old men told in the tavern, about orcs who pretended to be wounded to lure humans close, about their savage strength and their bloodlust. He thought of his friends who had died in the war, of the scars he still carried on his ribs from an orcish blade. But he also thought of the way she looked at him, her yellow eyes wide with fear, and he realized that she was not looking at him like a predator looked at prey. She was looking at him the way a dying animal looked at a hunter, knowing that the end was coming and too weak to do anything but wait for it. He set the lantern down on a barrel and held up his empty hands, speaking slowly and clearly. "I am not going to hurt you." She did not understand him. He could see that in the confusion that flickered across her face, in the way her body tensed even as she tried to scoot farther back against the wall. He took a step forward, and she bared her teeth, her tusks gleaming in the lamplight, a growl rising from her chest. But the growl turned into a cough, wet and painful, and she doubled over, her hand pressed to her side as fresh blood seeped between her fingers. Callum cursed under his breath and moved quickly, closing the distance between them before she could try to run or fight. She swung at him weakly, her fist catching him on the shoulder with barely any force, and he caught her wrist gently, lowering her arm back down to her side. "Easy," he said, his voice the same tone he used with his skittish mare. "Easy now, let me see." She was too weak to fight him. He eased her back against the wall and carefully pulled her hand away from the wound, lifting her torn shirt just enough to see the gash across her ribs. It was deep, the edges ragged, probably from a sword or an axe. Not fresh, maybe a day old and already showing signs of infection. She needed stitches, needed medicine, needed rest and food and warmth. She needed things he was not sure he could give her, not without risking everything he had built here. But if he did nothing, she would be dead by morning. He made his decision. Callum went to the shelf where he kept his medical supplies, the things left over from his soldier days, and brought back clean cloth, a bottle of whiskey, and a needle and thread. The girl watched him with wary eyes, her breathing ragged, and when he poured the whiskey over the wound to clean it, she screamed and tried to jerk away from him. He held her still, murmuring apologies she could not understand, and worked as quickly as he could, stitching the wound closed with hands that had done this too many times before. She bit down on her own arm to keep from screaming again, tears streaming down her face, her body rigid with pain. When it was done, he wrapped her ribs with clean cloth and sat back on his heels, exhausted. She was still conscious, barely, her eyes fixed on him with an expression he could not read. He fetched a blanket from the house, brought back bread and cheese and water and laid them beside her. She did not touch the food, but when he draped the blanket over her shoulders, she pulled it tight around herself, her shivering beginning to ease just slightly. "Stay here," he said, even though he knew she did not understand. "Rest. I will check on you in the morning." He left her there in the barn, locking the door behind him more out of habit than any real fear that she would try to leave in her condition and return to the house. But he did not sleep. He lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and wondered what in all the hells he had just done, and whether he would regret it come daylight. When dawn finally came, gray and rain washed, he returned to the barn with more food and a cup of hot broth. She was awake, sitting up with her back against the wall, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. She watched him approach with the same wary expression, but this time she did not growl or try to strike at him. When he offered her the cup, she hesitated for a long moment before taking it, her hands shaking as she brought it to her lips and drank. "What is your name?" he asked, settling down a few feet away from her, giving her space. She looked at him, her brow furrowing, and he realized again that she did not speak his language. He pointed to himself. "Callum," he said. Then he pointed to her and raised his eyebrows in question. Understanding dawned in her eyes. She touched her chest with one hand, the other still clutching the cup. "Grisha," she said, her voice hoarse and rough. "Grisha," he repeated, and something in her expression softened just slightly at the sound of her own name in his mouth. "All right, Grisha, you are safe here. For now." Over the next 3 days, Callum fell into a rhythm that felt surreal and dangerous and strangely natural all at once. He tended his fields in the morning, checking the crops and mending fences and doing all the work that kept a farm running, and then he would return to the barn to check on Grisha. Each time he opened the door, he half expected her to be gone, fled back into the hills or dead from her wound, but each time she was still there, a little stronger than before. He brought her food 3 times a day and fresh water, changed the bandages on her wound and checked for signs of infection. She let him tend to her now without fighting, though she still watched him with those wary yellow eyes, still tensed whenever he moved too quickly. He tried to talk to her, pointing at objects and saying their names, and she began to repeat them in her halting accent, her voice growing stronger each day. Blanket, water, bread, horse, light, pain. She was a quick learner, he realized. By the third day, she could understand simple commands and questions, could point to things and name them, could even string together a few basic sentences in his language. When he asked her what had happened, how she had come to be wounded and alone in his barn, she looked away and said only, "Fighting. My clan, I ran." He did not press her for more. He understood enough from those few words to know that she had fled her own people, that whatever had happened had been bad enough to drive her out into human lands with nothing but the clothes on her back. He understood that she was alone in the world now, caught between two peoples who would both kill her for different reasons. On the fourth morning, he came into the barn to find her standing, leaning heavily against the wall but on her feet nonetheless. She looked at him with something like defiance in her eyes, as though daring him to tell her to sit back down, and he could not help the small smile that tugged at his lips. She had strength, this one, spirit. He liked that. "You should not be walking yet," he said, crossing to her side. "Your wound will open." "I am strong," she said, her accent thick but her words clear. "I do not stay down. I can see that." He offered her his arm, and after a moment's hesitation she took it, letting him help her walk slowly around the barn. She winced with each step, her hand pressed to her bandaged ribs, but she did not complain and she did not stop until she had made it all the way to where his mare stood in her stall, watching them with curious dark eyes. Grisha reached out slowly, letting the horse sniff her hand, and then she stroked the mare's nose with surprising gentleness. "Beautiful," she said softly. "What is her name?" "Willow," Callum replied, watching the way Grisha's expression softened as she touched the horse. There was something peaceful in her face now, something that made her look younger and more vulnerable than the fierce, injured warrior he had found on his barn floor. "Willow," Grisha repeated, and the mare nickered softly, leaning into her touch. "She likes me." "She has good taste," Callum said, and then immediately felt like a fool for saying it, but Grisha turned to look at him with surprise in her eyes, and for the first time since he had found her, she smiled. It was a small smile, tentative and brief, but it transformed her face entirely, and Callum felt something shift in his chest, something warm and unexpected and more than a little frightening. He helped her back to her makeshift bed in the corner of the barn, and as he settled the blanket around her shoulders again, she caught his wrist with her hand. Her grip was gentle but firm, and when he looked up at her, he saw something in her eyes that made his breath catch. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why do you help me?" It was a good question. He had been asking himself the same thing for 4 days now, turning it over and over in his mind every time he came out to the barn, every time he brought her food or changed her bandages or sat with her in the quiet evening hours. He could have let her die. He could have driven her off his property. He could have turned her in to the local militia, who would have killed her or thrown her in chains. Any of those would have been the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. But when he looked at her now, he could not imagine having done anything differently. "Because you needed help," he said finally. "And I have never been good at walking away from people who need help." She studied his face for a long moment, her yellow eyes searching for something, and then she nodded slowly and released his wrist. "You are a good man, Callum Drake," she said, and the way she said his full name with such gravity and sincerity made his throat tight. "I am just a farmer," he said, trying to lighten the moment. "A farmer who apparently cannot resist taking in strays." "I am not a stray," she said, her chin lifting with a flash of pride. "I am Grisha of the Iron Ridge clan. I am a warrior. A wounded warrior sleeping in my barn, he pointed out, and she glared at him, but there was no real heat in it. For now, she said. When I am strong again, I will leave. I will not bring trouble to you. But even as she said it, Callum felt a strange pang at the thought of her leaving, and he pushed it aside, telling himself it was just concern for her safety, nothing more. The days turned into a week, and Grisha grew stronger. She began to move around the barn more freely, helping him with small tasks despite his protests that she should rest. She had a natural way with the animals, he noticed, gentle and patient with the horse, and even with the chickens that roosted in the rafters. She learned more of his language every day, picking up words and phrases with impressive speed. And in turn she taught him a few words of Orcish, laughing at his clumsy pronunciation. He learned that she had been part of a raiding party that had gone wrong, that her clan had attacked a human settlement and been driven back with heavy losses. She had been wounded in the fighting, but it was not the wound that had made her run. It was what had come after, when her clan leader had ordered them to return and slaughter everyone in the settlement, including the children. She had refused. She had spoken against it, and her clan leader had turned on her, declaring her a traitor and weak, tainted by human mercy. She had fought her way free and run, knowing that if she stayed she would be killed or cast out anyway. I could not do it, she said one evening as they sat together in the barn, sharing a simple dinner of bread and stew. The children were so small, so afraid. They looked at me with big eyes, and I saw myself when I was small, when human soldiers came to my village. I remembered the fear. I could not make another child feel that fear, not even a human child. Callum was silent for a long moment, turning her words over in his mind. He had spent 5 years of his life fighting orcs, had been taught to see them as monsters, as enemies to be destroyed. But Grisha was not a monster. She was a person, as complex and flawed and capable of mercy as any human he had ever known. That took courage, he said finally. To stand against your own clan. She shook her head. It was not courage, it was weakness. That is what they called it, weakness and shame. They were wrong, Callum said firmly. Mercy is not weakness, it is the hardest kind of strength there is. She looked at him with those searching yellow eyes, and he saw vulnerability there, a deep need to be understood. You really believe that, she said softly. Even though I am an orc, even though my people killed yours. You are not your people, he said. You are yourself. And from what I have seen, yourself is pretty damned decent. A smile tugged at the corners of her mouth, and she ducked her head, her dark hair falling forward to hide her face. But he could see the color rising in her cheeks, could see the way her shoulders relaxed just slightly, and he felt that warm thing in his chest again, growing stronger. The second week brought new complications. Callum went into the nearby town to sell his early vegetables and buy supplies, and while he was at the market, he overheard men talking about orc sightings in the hills. There had been attacks on 2 farms to the north, livestock stolen and buildings burned. The local militia was forming patrols, and there was talk of organizing a larger force to push the orcs back into the mountains. Callum bought his supplies quickly and returned home, his mind racing. If the militia started patrolling this area, they would eventually search his property. They would find Grisha, and no amount of explanation would save her or him from what would happen next. Harboring an orc was treason, grounds for imprisonment or worse. When he got back to the farm, he found Grisha in the barn brushing down Willow, moving with only a slight stiffness from her healing wound. She looked up when he entered, and her smile of greeting faded when she saw his expression. "What is wrong?" she asked, setting down the brush. He told her what he had heard and watched her face close off, the warmth draining from her eyes as she processed the information. I will leave tonight, she said flatly. I have put you in danger long enough. Where will you go? He demanded. Back to your clan who tried to kill you. Out into the wilderness alone. Grisha, you will not survive a week out there. I will manage, she said stubbornly. I have survived worse. Have you? He stepped closer to her, frustration and fear making his voice sharp. You were barely alive when I found you. You would have died if you had been alone one more day. Better me dead than both of us, she shot back, her own voice rising. You do not understand what they will do to you if they find me here. They will call you a traitor. They will take your farm, throw you in prison, maybe hang you. I will not let you suffer for my sake. And I will not let you walk out of here to die, he said. And they stood there glaring at each other, both breathing hard, the air between them charged with emotion. Grisha broke first, turning away and wrapping her arms around herself. Why do you care so much? She asked, her voice quieter now, almost broken. I am nothing to you. Just an orc you found in your barn. You should hate me. Your people hate mine. You fought in the war, you told me that. Why do you not hate me? Callum ran a hand through his hair, trying to find the words for something he barely understood himself. I did hate orcs, he admitted. When I was a soldier, I hated them so much I could barely think straight. Every time we went into battle, I was so full of rage that I did not care if I lived or died as long as I could take down as many of your people as possible. I lost friends in that war, good men who deserved better than to die in the mud. And for a long time after I came here, I carried that hate with me. It poisoned everything. He took a breath, choosing his next words carefully. But then I found you, and you were not what I expected. You were not a monster. You were just a girl who was hurt and alone and terrified. And taking care of you, talking with you, learning about you, it made me realize that I had been hating an idea, not the reality. You are real, Grisha. You laugh and you hurt and you have principles you are willing to die for. You are not my enemy. You are my friend. She turned back to face him, tears shining in her eyes. I have never had a human friend, she said, her voice shaking. I have never had a human show me kindness, not once in my whole life. And now you have given me everything, and I do not know how to repay you except by leaving so I do not destroy your life. You are not destroying my life, he said, closing the distance between them and taking her hands in his. Her skin was warm, her fingers calloused from years of wielding weapons and working with her hands. You are making it better. These past 2 weeks, having you here, talking with you, getting to know you, I have not been this happy in years. I know it is complicated. I know there are 100 reasons why this is a bad idea, but I do not want you to leave, Grisha. I want you to stay. She stared up at him, her yellow eyes wide and shining with tears. Callum, she whispered, and he could hear a world of emotion in that single word. I want to stay. But I am afraid. So am I, he admitted. But we will figure it out together. She nodded slowly and then, almost shyly, she leaned forward and rested her forehead against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her carefully, mindful of her still healing wound, and held her close. She was strong and warm and solid in his arms, and he felt something settle into place inside him, something that felt right in a way nothing had in a very long time. They stood there for a long moment, holding each other in the quiet barn, and Callum made a silent promise to himself that he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. The solution came to him 2 days later while he was working in his fields. If anyone came looking, they would search the barn first, the house second. But there was one place on his property that no one ever bothered with. The old root cellar at the edge of the property, half buried in the hillside and choked with weeds. It had been there when he bought the farm, built by whoever had owned the land before him, and he had never had much use for it. But if he cleared it out, made it comfortable, It could serve as a hiding place. He told Grisha his plan that evening, and together they worked to transform the cellar. He cleared out the debris and cobwebs, brought down blankets and a straw mattress, set up a small stove for warmth and cooking. Grisha helped where she could, her wound mostly healed now, only a faint stiffness remaining when she moved. They worked side by side in comfortable silence, and Callum found himself acutely aware of her presence, the way her shoulder brushed his when they passed each other in the narrow space, the sound of her breathing in the quiet. When they were finished, the cellar was small but cozy, a hidden sanctuary that no one would think to look for. Grisha stood in the doorway looking in and then turned to him with a smile. "It is perfect," she said. "Thank you, Callum." "You are welcome," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. But even with the hiding place prepared, danger came sooner than either of them expected. 3 days later, Callum was in the barn tending to Willow when he heard the sound of horses approaching. He looked out to see 4 men on horseback riding up the path to his farm, all of them armed, all of them wearing the insignia of the local militia. Panic shot through him. Grisha was in the barn with him, helping him mend some tack. They had gotten comfortable, careless, and now there was no time to get her to the cellar without being seen. "Hide," he hissed at her, and she moved instantly, slipping into an empty stall and burrowing under a pile of hay. He arranged it quickly to cover her completely, and then forced himself to walk calmly out of the barn to greet the riders. The leader was a man named Harold, a veteran of the war like Callum, someone he had served with briefly. Harold dismounted and clasped Callum's arm in greeting. "Callum Drake," he said. "Good to see you well, Harold. What brings you out this way?" Callum kept his voice casual, friendly, even as his heart hammered against his ribs. "We are patrolling for orcs," Harold said, his expression grim. "There have been more attacks. We are checking all the farms in the area, making sure everyone is safe and accounted for. You have not seen anything unusual? Any signs of orc activity?" "Nothing," Callum said, shaking his head. "It has been quiet here." Harold nodded, but his eyes were scanning the farm, taking in the fields and the house and the barn. "Mind if we take a look around, just to be thorough?" Callum's blood went cold, but he forced himself to shrug. "Of course, help yourselves." The 4 men spread out, 2 heading for the house and 2 toward the barn. Callum followed the ones going to the barn, trying to look unconcerned even as his mind raced. If they searched the stalls, if they looked in the hay, they would find Grisha, and then everything would be over. He watched as the men walked through the barn, looking in the stalls and checking the loft. One of them paused near the stall where Grisha was hidden, and Callum's hand drifted toward the knife at his belt, his muscles tensing. If they found her, he would have to fight. He could not let them take her. But then Willow, bless her, nickered loudly and kicked at her stall door, drawing the men's attention. They moved toward her instead, and Callum quickly stepped forward. "She gets nervous around strangers," he said, moving to calm the mare. "Let me settle her down." He made a show of soothing Willow, talking to her softly and stroking her neck, and the men lost interest, moving on to check the rest of the barn. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few minutes, they regrouped outside. "Everything looks clear," one of them reported to Harold. "No signs of orc activity." Harold nodded and turned back to Callum. "Good. You will let us know if you see anything, of course," Callum said. "You can count on me." The men mounted their horses and rode off, and Callum stood there watching them go, not moving until they were completely out of sight. Then he turned and ran back into the barn, falling to his knees beside the stall and digging through the hay with shaking hands. Grisha emerged from the hiding place, hay stuck in her hair, her eyes wide. "They are gone?" she asked. They are gone, he confirmed, and then, without thinking, he pulled her into his arms and held her tight, his heart still racing with the fear of how close they had come to disaster. She clung to him just as tightly, her face buried in his shoulder, and he could feel her trembling. "I thought they had found me," she whispered. "I thought it was over." "So did I," he admitted, and then he pulled back just enough to look at her face, to cup her cheek with his hand. "Grisha, we cannot keep doing this. It is too dangerous. We need a better plan." "What plan?" she asked, her voice thick with fear and frustration. "There is nowhere safe for me, not in your world, not in mine. I am caught between, and there is no place for someone like me." "Then we make a place," he said fiercely. "We find a way. I do not care what it takes, Grisha. I am not losing you." She stared at him, and he saw the exact moment when understanding dawned in her eyes, when she realized what he was really saying. "Callum," she breathed, "you do not mean that." "You cannot mean that." "I do," he said, and he had never been more certain of anything in his life. "I care about you, Grisha. More than I should, probably more than is wise, but I cannot help it. These past weeks with you have been the best I have had in years, and the thought of you leaving, of anything happening to you, I cannot bear it. So yes, I mean it. Whatever it takes, we will find a way to make this work." Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "You are insane," she said. "Completely insane. I am an orc, you are human. There is no world where this works." "Then we will make our own world," he said, and he leaned in and kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, giving her every chance to pull away. But she did not pull away. Instead, she leaned into him, her hands coming up to grip his shirt, and kissed him back with a desperation that matched his own. She tasted like the honey he had given her with her breakfast, sweet and warm. And when he felt the slight press of her tusks against his lips, it did not frighten him at all. It just made her more real, more herself, more the person he was falling in love with. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she rested her forehead against his. "This is madness," she whispered. "Probably," he agreed, "but I do not care. Your people will hate you for this. They will call you a traitor, an orc lover. They will destroy everything you have built here." "Let them try," he said. "You are worth more to me than any of it." She closed her eyes, fresh tears leaking from beneath her lids. "I do not deserve you." "You deserve everything," he told her, and kissed her again, softer this time, a promise and a vow all in one. They spent the rest of that day and evening planning. They could not stay here. They both knew that now. It was only a matter of time before the militia returned, or before someone else discovered Grisha's presence. They needed to leave, to go somewhere they could be safe, somewhere they could start over. Callum had heard stories of the far frontier, beyond the settled lands, where the king's law did not quite reach, and people did not ask too many questions about each other's pasts. It was wild country, dangerous, but it offered something that nowhere else did: freedom. If they could reach it, if they could stake a claim and build a homestead, they might have a chance. It would mean leaving everything he had worked for here, the farm he had built with his own hands. But when he looked at Grisha, sitting beside him in the lamplight as they bent over his rough map of the region, he knew without doubt that he would do it. She was more important than any plot of land, any house or barn or field. "We will need supplies," he said, making a list. "Food for the journey, tools, seed for planting. Weapons in case we run into trouble. It will take me a few days to gather everything and sell what I cannot take." "I can help," Grisha said immediately. "I am strong, I can carry things, I can hunt. You need to stay hidden," he interrupted gently. "Just for a few more days. Once we are on the road, I will need all the help you can give. But right now, the safest thing is for no one to know you are here." She nodded reluctantly, and he squeezed her hand. "It will be all right," he said. "We can do this. Over the next 4 days, Callum worked from dawn to dusk preparing for their departure. He sold willow to a neighboring farmer, along with most of his tools and furniture. He packed what they would need into 2 large packs, and a wagon he could pull himself if necessary. He bought supplies in 3 different towns, so no one would notice the quantity or wonder what he was doing. And every evening he returned to the farm and spent time with Grisha, holding her close and making quiet plans for their future. She taught him more of her language in those evenings, and he taught her more of his. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories of their childhoods, their families, their hopes and fears. He learned that she loved music, but could not carry a tune, that she was afraid of deep water because she had nearly drowned as a child, that her favorite food was roasted rabbit with wild herbs. She learned that he had wanted to be a carpenter before the war, that he still had nightmares sometimes about the battles he had fought, that he had always dreamed of having a family, but had never expected to meet anyone in his isolated corner of the frontier. "You will have a family now," she told him one evening, her head resting on his shoulder as they sat together in the barn. "If you want one, with me." His heart swelled so full he thought it might burst. "I want that more than anything," he said, and he tilted her face up to kiss her, slow and deep, pouring everything he felt into that contact. When they finally broke apart, she was smiling, that soft, shy smile he had come to love. "I never thought I would be happy," she confessed. "Not after everything that happened with my clan. I thought I would spend the rest of my life alone, hunted and hated by everyone. But then I found you, or you found me, and now I have hope again. You gave me that, Callum. You gave me hope." "You gave it to me too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I was so lonely here, so tired of being alone. And then you came into my life and everything changed. You make me want to be better, to build something worth having. You make me feel alive again." She kissed him again, and they stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, savoring the quiet peace before the journey ahead. On the 5th day, everything was ready. They would leave at dawn, traveling west toward the unsettled lands. Callum had plotted a route that would keep them away from towns and main roads as much as possible, following game trails and old paths through the forest. It would take them 3 weeks, maybe 4, but if they were careful and lucky, they could make it without encountering anyone who would cause trouble. That final night, Callum could not sleep. He lay in his bed in the house, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything he was leaving behind. This farm had been his sanctuary, his fresh start after the horrors of war. He had built it with his own hands, poured his sweat and blood into every field and fence and beam. Walking away from it felt like tearing off a piece of his soul. But staying would mean losing Grisha, and that was unthinkable. He rose before dawn and went to the barn to find her already awake, her few belongings packed and ready. She was wearing the spare clothes he had given her, a shirt and trousers that had belonged to him and fit her reasonably well, and she had tied back her hair in a practical braid. She looked nervous but determined, and when she saw him, she crossed to him and took his hands. "Are you certain about this?" she asked quietly. "There is still time to change your mind. You do not have to give up everything for me." "I am not giving up anything that matters," he said firmly. "You are what matters. Now let us go before I lose my nerve." They loaded the wagon and left the farm just as the sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Callum did not look back. He could not bear to, afraid that if he did he would falter. Instead he kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, on the future they were traveling toward, and on Grisha walking beside him, her hand warm in his. The first week of travel was uneventful. They kept to the back roads and forest trails, camping each night in secluded spots well off the path. Grisha proved to be an excellent traveling companion, strong and uncomplaining, helping to pull the wagon when the terrain got rough, and setting up their camps with efficient speed. She hunted with a makeshift bow Callum fashioned for her, bringing down rabbits and birds to supplement their supplies, and she taught him how to find edible plants in the forest, knowledge from her childhood that proved invaluable. They fell into an easy rhythm, working together seamlessly, and Callum found himself marveling at how natural it all felt. He had been alone for so long that he had forgotten what it was like to have a partner, someone to share the burdens and joys of daily life. And Grisha was more than just a partner. She was funny and sharp and endlessly curious about the world, asking him questions about human customs and telling him stories about orcish traditions. They laughed together over their clumsy attempts to cook on the open fire and held each other close at night when the forest sounds grew ominous and the darkness pressed in. But on the 8th day, their luck ran out. They were following a narrow trail through dense forest when they heard voices ahead, male and rough, speaking in the common tongue. Callum signaled for Grisha to stay back and crept forward to investigate. Through the trees, he could see 3 men standing beside the trail, all of them armed, all of them with the hard look of people who made their living on the wrong side of the law. Bandits, or worse. He backed away carefully and returned to where Grisha waited. "Bandits," he said quietly. 3 of them blocking the trail ahead. "We need to go around." But even as he said it, he heard more voices behind them. They were surrounded. Grisha heard it too, and her expression hardened, her hand going to the knife at her belt. "We fight?" she asked. "Only if we have no choice," Callum said, his mind racing. "Stay close to me. If I tell you to run, you run." "I do not run," she said fiercely. "Not from bandits, not from anyone. We fight together or not at all." There was no time to argue. The men ahead were moving toward them, and the ones behind were closing in. Callum drew his sword, a blade he had kept from his soldier days, and positioned himself in front of Grisha, ready to defend her with his life if necessary. The leader of the bandits, a tall man with a scar across his face, stepped into view and grinned when he saw them. "Well, well," he said. "What do we have here? A farmer and his pack mule. You picked the wrong road, friend." "We do not want trouble," Callum said evenly. "We are just passing through. Let us go and you can have whatever we are carrying." The bandit leader laughed and his men joined in. "Oh, we will take what you are carrying, do not worry about that. But first I think we will have a bit of fun. My boys have not seen a woman in weeks, and even a plain one like your traveling companion there will do to pass the time." Rage flared hot in Callum's chest, but before he could respond, Grisha stepped out from behind him. And as she did, she pulled the hood back from her head, revealing her green skin, her pointed ears, her tusks. The laughter died instantly. "I am not plain," Grisha said, her voice cold and deadly. "I am an orc, and if you touch me or him, I will tear your throat out with my bare hands." The bandits stared at her in shock, and then the leader's face twisted with hatred. "An orc," he spat, "and an orc lover. Well, that makes this even better. Kill them both. The king offers a bounty for every orc head and we could use the coin." The bandits moved in, weapons drawn, and Callum knew they had no choice now. It was fight or die. He met the first man's attack with his sword, parrying the blow and countering with a strike that caught the bandit across the arm, drawing blood. Beside him, Grisha moved like lightning, her knife flashing as she ducked under a wild swing and buried the blade in the second man's leg. He screamed and went down, and she ripped the knife free and spun to face the next attacker. The fight was brutal and chaotic. Callum's soldier training came back to him in a rush, muscle memory guiding his movements as he fought off two men at once. He was vaguely aware of Grisha beside him, fighting with a savage grace that was both terrifying and beautiful to watch. She was all speed and power, her orcish strength more than a match for the humans she faced. But they were outnumbered, and the bandits were experienced fighters. Callum took a cut across his shoulder that sent pain lancing down his arm, and he saw Grisha stumble as a club glanced off her ribs, right where her wound had healed. She cried out but did not go down, lashing out with her knife and catching her attacker across the face. The leader came at Callum with a snarl, his sword swinging in a deadly arc. Callum blocked it but felt the impact shudder up his injured arm, weakening his grip. The bandit pressed his advantage, raining down blows that drove Callum back step by step. He was going to lose, he realized with a spike of fear. He was going to die here and Grisha with him. But then Grisha was there, slamming into the bandit leader from the side and bearing him to the ground. They struggled, and Callum saw the glint of steel, heard the wet sound of a blade finding flesh. The bandit leader went still, and Grisha rose, blood on her hands and her knife, her chest heaving. The remaining bandits, seeing their leader dead, broke and ran, crashing through the underbrush in their haste to escape. Callum and Grisha stood there in the sudden silence, both of them bleeding, both of them shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline. "Are you all right?" Callum gasped, stumbling toward her. "I am fine," she said, but he could see the pain in her eyes the way she held her side. "You are hurt." "So are you." He pulled her close, checking her over frantically, and saw that the blow to her ribs had reopened part of her wound. Blood seeped through her shirt, and he cursed under his breath. "We need to stop the bleeding." They found a stream a short distance from the trail and made camp there, hidden in a thick copse of trees. Callum cleaned and bandaged Grisha's wound first, his hands gentle despite the urgency, and then she did the same for his shoulder. The cut was not deep, but it hurt like hell, and he hissed through his teeth as she stitched it closed. "I am sorry," she murmured, her face tight with concentration. "I am trying to be gentle." "You are doing fine," he assured her, and when she tied off the last stitch and bandaged his shoulder, he pulled her down to sit beside him. They leaned against each other, exhausted and hurting but alive. "That was too close," Grisha said after a long silence. "We could have died." "But we did not," Callum said. "We fought together and we won. You were amazing, Grisha. I have never seen anyone fight like that." She ducked her head, but he could see the pleased flush in her cheeks. "You were not so bad yourself, for a farmer." He laughed, and after a moment she joined him, and they sat there in the forest laughing like idiots, the tension and fear draining away into something like giddy relief. "I killed that man," Grisha said after their laughter faded. "I have killed in battle before, but this felt different. I killed him to protect you." "And I would have killed to protect you," Callum said. "That is what we do now, we protect each other, no matter what." She looked at him, her yellow eyes shining with emotion. "I love you," she said, the words simple and raw and utterly sincere. "I did not mean to, I tried not to, but I do. I love you, Callum Drake." His heart felt like it might explode from the sheer joy of hearing those words. "I love you too," he said, cupping her face in his hands. "I have loved you for weeks now, I think. Maybe since the first time you smiled at me. I love you, Grisha, with everything I am." She kissed him then, deep and desperate, and he kissed her back with the same intensity, trying to pour everything he felt into that contact. They clung to each other there beside the stream, two people from different worlds who had found something precious and rare. And they made silent promises to each other that they would hold on to it, no matter what came. They rested for 2 days by the stream, letting their injuries heal enough to travel again. On the 3rd day they pushed on, moving deeper into the wilderness, leaving the settled lands farther behind with every mile. The journey grew harder as the terrain became rougher, but it also became more beautiful. They traveled through forests thick with ancient trees, crossed meadows carpeted with wildflowers, climbed hills that offered views of mountains rising in the distance. They saw deer and elk, hawks circling overhead, once even a bear that Grisha watched with fascination from a safe distance. "It is beautiful here," she said one evening as they made camp on a ridge overlooking a valley. "Wild and free. I feel like I can breathe here." "So do I," Callum agreed, sitting beside her and taking her hand. "This is what I wanted when I left the army and went to that farm. I wanted peace and quiet, a place away from the world, but I was still so close to everything that I could never really escape it. Out here, though, it feels like we have left all that behind, like we have found something new." "A new world just for us," Grisha said, echoing his words from weeks ago, and she leaned her head on his shoulder. "I like that idea." They reached the far frontier 3 weeks after leaving Callum's farm. The land here was unclaimed and wild, with only a few scattered homesteads marking where other brave or desperate souls had tried to carve out a life. Callum found a spot that spoke to him, a small valley with a stream running through it, good soil, timber for building, and a view of the mountains that took his breath away. "This is it," he said, looking around at the land with satisfaction. "This is where we build our home." Grisha walked the land with him, her eyes taking in every detail, and when they returned to the center of the valley, she nodded. "Yes," she said, "this is good. This is ours." They spent the first weeks clearing a space and building a small cabin, working from dawn to dusk with aching muscles and determination. Grisha turned out to be as good a builder as she was a fighter, strong and skilled with her hands, and together they raised the walls and roof of a sturdy little house. Callum built a small barn for the animals they would eventually acquire, and Grisha planted a garden with the seeds he had brought, using knowledge from her childhood to coax life from the soil. It was hard work, exhausting and sometimes frustrating, but it was also deeply satisfying. Every board they nailed, every stone they laid, was a piece of the life they were building together. And in the evenings, when the work was done and they sat together by the fire, Callum felt a contentment he had never known before. "Do you regret it?" Grisha asked him one night, a few months after they had arrived. They were sitting on the porch of their finished cabin watching the stars come out. "Leaving your farm, giving up everything you had?" "Not for a second," Callum said immediately. "That farm was just a place. This is a home. Because you are here." She smiled and leaned into him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders, holding her close. They sat there in comfortable silence, and Callum thought about how far they had come, how much they had overcome to reach this moment. It had not been easy. It would never be easy, living on the edge of the wilderness, building a life from nothing. But they had each other, and that made it all worthwhile. The first winter was hard. Snow fell early and deep, and they spent long weeks trapped inside the cabin, keeping the fire burning and rationing their food carefully. But even in the hardship, there was joy. They told each other stories to pass the time, played games with stones and sticks, made love slowly and tenderly beneath piles of furs and blankets. Grisha taught Callum songs in the Orcish tongue, and he taught her to read and write in the common language, watching with pride as she laboriously formed letters on scraps of paper. When spring finally came, melting the snow and bringing life back to the valley, they emerged from the cabin like bears from hibernation and threw themselves into expanding their homestead. They built a proper barn and acquired chickens and goats from a trader who passed through. They expanded the garden and planted a field of wheat. They built a smokehouse and a root cellar, preparing for the next winter. And slowly, carefully, they began to reach out to their distant neighbors. There were 3 other homesteads within a day's ride, and Callum visited each one, introducing himself and explaining that he had a partner, an orc woman, and that they were looking to be left in peace. The reactions varied. One family slammed the door in his face. Another listened with suspicion but grudging acceptance. The third, an older couple who had been on the frontier for decades, simply shrugged and said that everyone out here was running from something, and as long as Callum and Grisha did not cause trouble, they were welcome to be neighbors. It was not perfect, but it was enough. They were not accepted, not really, but they were tolerated, and that was more than Callum had dared hope for. Life settled into a rhythm over the following year. They worked hard, but they also made time for each other, for laughter and joy and the small pleasures of everyday life. Grisha blossomed in the freedom of their isolated valley, growing confident and happy, her smiles coming easily now. Callum watched her with constant amazement, still hardly able to believe that she was real, that this life was real. They talked sometimes about the future, about what it would be like to have children, to raise them in this place where they would be free from the prejudices that had shaped both of their lives. It was a frightening thought and an exciting one, and they agreed that someday, when they felt ready, they would take that step. But for now, they were content with what they had built. On the 2nd anniversary of the night Callum had found Grisha in his barn, they stood together on the ridge overlooking their valley and looked at everything they had created. The cabin was sturdy and warm, the barn was full of healthy animals, the fields were planted and growing well. It was not much compared to the grand estates of the nobility, but it was theirs, built with their own hands and their own love. "Happy?" Callum asked, slipping his arm around Grisha's waist. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she said, leaning into him. "I have you, I have a home, I have a future. What more could I want? How about a wedding?" Callum said and watched her eyes go wide with surprise. "A wedding," she repeated. "But we cannot, there is no one to officiate, and your people do not recognize marriages between humans and orcs." "I do not care what my people recognize," Callum interrupted. "I care what we recognize. We can make our own vows, our own promises. It does not need to be official or legal. It just needs to be real. So what do you say, Grisha? Will you marry me?" Tears spilled down her cheeks and she let out a laugh that was half sob. "Yes," she said. "Yes, of course I will marry you, you ridiculous man." He kissed her there on the ridge, with the wind in their hair and the valley spread out below them, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. They prepared for the ceremony over the next week, making it a celebration even though they would be the only ones in attendance. Grisha wove wildflowers into a crown and made a new dress from fabric she had traded for in the nearest settlement. Callum carved wooden rings from a fallen oak tree, polishing them until they gleamed. They cleaned the cabin until it shone and prepared a feast with the best food they had. On the appointed day, they dressed in their finest and walked together to the spot where they had first decided to build their home. It was late afternoon, the light golden and warm, and the valley was alive with the sounds of summer. They stood facing each other, hands clasped, and Callum spoke first. "Grisha, from the moment I found you in my barn, my life changed. You have given me hope and joy and purpose. You have shown me what it means to be brave, to stand up for what is right even when it costs everything. I promise to love you, to protect you, to stand beside you no matter what comes. I promise to build a life with you that is worthy of the courage it took to get here. I promise to be yours, now and always." Grisha was crying openly now, and she took a shaky breath before speaking. "Callum, you saved my life that night. But you did more than that. You saved my soul. You showed me that I was worth saving, that I was worth loving. You gave me a home when I had nowhere to go and a future when I thought I had none. I promise to love you with all that I am. I promise to fight beside you, to work beside you, to build our dreams together. I promise to be yours in this life and whatever comes after. Callum slipped the wooden ring onto her finger, and she did the same for him. And then, with no one to witness but the wind and the birds and the mountains in the distance, they kissed as husband and wife. That night they celebrated, eating their feast and dancing to music only they could hear, and when they finally went to bed, they made love with a tenderness and passion that left them both breathless and complete. The years that followed were not always easy, but they were good. There were hard winters and dry summers, times when money was tight and the work was grueling. There were moments of fear when travelers passed through who looked at Grisha with suspicion and hatred. There were nights when Grisha had nightmares about her clan, and Callum had nightmares about the war, and they held each other through the darkness until morning came. But there was also so much joy. The first time Grisha realized she was pregnant, her face lit up with a radiance that made Callum's heart ache with love. The day their daughter was born, a beautiful little girl with her mother's green skin and her father's brown eyes, Callum held her in his arms and wept with happiness. And then, 3 years later, their son arrived, strong and loud and perfect. They raised their children in the valley, teaching them to work hard and love fiercely, to respect all people regardless of what they looked like, to stand up for what was right even when it was difficult. Their children grew up strong and happy, and sometimes traders or neighbors would stop by and marvel at the mixed family, at the love and warmth that filled their home. And slowly, very slowly, attitudes began to change. Other families moved to the frontier, including a few orc families fleeing the same prejudice that Grisha had faced. Callum and Grisha welcomed them, helped them get established, and over time a small community formed, one where humans and orcs lived and worked side by side. It was not perfect, and there were still those who hated and feared, but it was progress, and it gave them hope. On the 20th anniversary of the night they had met, Callum and Grisha stood together on the same ridge where they had married, watching their grown children work in the fields below. Their daughter was teaching her younger brother some new technique for planting, and their laughter drifted up on the breeze. "We did well," Grisha said softly, her hand in Callum's. She was older now, her dark hair streaked with gray, lines around her eyes and mouth, but to Callum she was as beautiful as the day he had found her. "We did better than well," Callum said, his own hair mostly gray now, his body bearing the marks of decades of hard work. "We built something real here, something good, a place where our children can be proud of who they are, where they do not have to hide or be ashamed." "A new world," Grisha said, smiling at him, "just like you promised." "Just like we built together," Callum corrected, and he kissed her, slow and sweet, a kiss that held 20 years of love and struggle and triumph. Below them, their children looked up and saw their parents standing together on the ridge, and they smiled and waved. And in that moment, everything felt right. All the fear and pain and hardship had been worth it, had led them to this place, this life, this family. They had started with nothing but each other, two people from different worlds who should have been enemies, and they had built a future together that neither of them could have imagined. They had proved that love could cross any divide, that home was not a place, but the people you chose to stand beside. And as the sun set over their valley, painting the sky in brilliant colors, Callum and Grisha stood together and watched their world, the world they had made, and knew that they were exactly where they were meant to be. The future stretched before them still, uncertain and full of challenges, but they would face it the way they had faced everything else. Together, with love and courage and an unshakable faith in each other. It was more than enough. It was everything.